What is up, everybody? We are so back. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the weirdest, most obscure, and most outrageous conspiracy theories and other weird things. We're going to be looking at hydrophobia experiments, tap water blacklist, total predictive anticipatory software, and so much more. Now, I'm just going to give a little heads up before this video. I'm going to be covering some really outrageous stuff in this one. Now, I'm definitely going to throw in my little opinions here and there, but most of these theories are pretty out there and pretty unbelievable, so don't immediately assume that I align with any of these. With that said, let's get into it. Starting off, we've got depression overriding. So this is probably going to sound like obvious or superficial, but essentially people on the internet have theorized that you can kind of just eliminate or cure depression by focusing intensely on the positive aspects of every component of your life. People have said that if you're depressed for too long, your neural pathways are going to habitually form into patterns that only really stimulate depressive thoughts. But if we expose ourselves to so much positivity, we can kind of rewire our brain to eliminate those depressive thoughts. Now, obviously, if you're actually suffering from depression, the mental strain it would take to completely cure yourself is just not really realistic. Of course, depression does not last forever, but it's going to take more to feel better than to simply adopt a positive mindset, because that's much easier said than done. Things like this would probably fall under the term biohacking, which is kind of a buzzword for when people try like different lifestyle modifications to ultimately better themselves. Some of these do actually make sense, like intermittent fasting, which has shown to be quite beneficial for some people. Depression overriding, however, would probably be considered a bit more pseudoscientific, like dopamine fasting.
Adonis has tricked his brain into loving hard work. He's in the gym doing a killer leg day, squatting 500 kilograms.
Ascension blacklist. So in spirituality, ascension is the process of rising to a higher state of consciousness or existence, which often involves shedding your physical desires and essentially upgrading to a more abstract state, whether that involves you staying in the real world or not. For example, after Jesus Christ had been resurrected and completed his mission on earth, he's said to have ascended to heaven. Now, the idea of an ascension blacklist or ascendance prevention basically refers to the idea that there are either physical or otherworldly entities that are attempting to prevent humanity's spiritual progress. One way that these entities are preventing humanity's spiritual progress is by feeding off of lower level states of consciousness. It's also theorized that by maintaining global control over the masses, they can kind of keep people from spiritually progressing. Evidence that people use to support these claims vary widely, but most often people cite the growing focus on materialism in the real world, which would attach people more to their physical existences rather than their spiritual ones. Whether or not you're a spiritual person, the existence of an ascension blacklist seems to rely pretty heavily on subjective and empirical evidence. Gangster computer god worldwide. So, back in the 1980s, there was a man named Francis Edward Deck, and this guy was most prominently known for these really long diatribes or rants that he would write and record and then publish. After Deck was finished fighting in World War II, he sent a few legal letters to the Supreme Court, which were deemed incoherent and got him sent to a psychiatric hospital in 1961. After his 60-day stay there, he would spend the next 25 years writing these really long and angry screeds, which most often talked about the communist gangster computer god, and how this entity was able to mind control the masses with these devices he called Frankenstein radio controls. He was also like really racist and anti-Semitic. Some of Deck's pieces were narrated on the KROQ FM radio station in the 90s, and they're pretty outrageous to listen to.
Even in thin skulls of white pedigree males, visible Frankenstein controls, the synthetic nerve radio directional antenna loop. Make copies for yourself. There is no escape from this worst gangster police state.
You can definitely tell that he's not really following like a clear path of discussion, and he's just kind of saying a bunch of words. Unfortunately, Deck passed away in 1996. Russian skin sight. So, back in the 1960s, a Soviet scientist performed a few experiments with these women who claimed to be able to determine what colors they were touching solely based on touch and with no vision. These women had blindfolds on and were given a color wheel with 8 colors on it, and were asked to place their fingertips on each color and then say the color out loud. The women were tested for about 60 hours total over several sessions, and were able to properly identify the colors to the extent that there was, quote, no possibility of a hoax. Now, dermoptical perception, which is the formal name for determining color solely through the skin, is pretty widely considered to be pseudoscientific. The experiment conducted in the Soviet Union wasn't really properly documented, so nobody can really verify the credibility of the experiment. Several other experiments were performed in the United States throughout the 20th century, but pretty much every one of them proved that the participant that claimed to be able to see color through their skin couldn't really do that. When tested under controlled conditions, a teenager named Pat Marquise, who was sometimes called the boy with X-ray eyes, was found to be peeking through his blindfold down his nose area. Time began with the detonation of the atomic bomb. So this one is pretty out there. This one doesn't really mean that time started with the detonation of the atomic bomb. I know that's what it says. What this one's actually referring to is the theory that the detonation of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima was so dangerous and so potentially detrimental to the future of the world that future generations who have the ability to time travel have gone back to the detonation and made sure that we did it correctly so that the world doesn't end. Back right around when the bomb was going to be detonated, people didn't know as much about atomic bombs as they do now. People were afraid that it would essentially catch the atmosphere on fire and end the world. This wasn't really a possibility, but there were other issues that could have arisen had the bomb been detonated incorrectly. This would mean that we're living in a timeline where our future selves went back and made sure we didn't blow up the bomb incorrectly and cause a nuclear winter.
I don't know how well you guys can see him right now.
Nothing exists outside of your vision. Basically, this theory states that it is literally impossible to prove that any physical thing exists outside of your own mind. There is no way to conduct any experiment that would prove this outside of our own subjective experience, so we cannot prove that everything we experience isn't simply a construct of our own mind. Now, this is pretty similar to a branch of philosophy called Solipsism, which basically states that the only thing we can be sure exists is one's own mind. Now, this is a pretty interesting topic, but ultimately, it's useless. It's obviously your choice to choose to believe that nothing exists outside of your own mind, but that doesn't really stop the world from continuing around you. Even if you believe reality isn't real, you kind of have to pretend it is in order to continue living your life. This has led people to wonder if there really is a way to prove that reality exists instead of having to just accept that it does or doesn't. Now, if your heart completely stops and you are completely unconscious to the outside world, really the only way for you to come back is if someone else revives you. This would pretty much prove that something else exists. However, again, there's no way to prove that your subjective experience hasn't just stopped and started independently and then fooled you into thinking something else was the cause of that. You can just kind of go back and forth forever and never really prove or disprove that reality is real or not, but most people can just choose to believe it is so that they can continue to live their life. GGGQEP. So GGGQEP, which is an abbreviation of gadolinium gallium garnet quantum electronic processing, is referring to a really long string of text that's been floating around the internet for a few years. These few paragraphs outline how, theoretically, if you were to take the crystalline material called gadolinium gallium garnet, which is a real material, and arrange it into a roughly 5 by 5 by 5 centimeter cube, you would have approximately 1 mole of the GGG molecules. And because of gadolinium gallium garnet's ability to store incredible amounts of data per molecule, a 5 by 5 by 5 centimeter cube of it would be able to store about 8,153 exabytes of data, an exabyte being about 1 million terabytes. Now, as of 2020, the internet was at roughly 64 zettabytes of data, and 1 zettabyte is 1,024 exabytes. So with a couple of these, you'd be able to have the entire internet on a little cube. Now, this is not practically possible with modern technology, and I don't know if it ever will be possible because it seems to be pretty much solely speculation. Electromagnetic effects on human body.zip. So Muckrock is the name of a non-profit organization which helps people with filing FOIA requests. And a FOIA request is a request sent to the executive branch of the United States, which uses the Freedom of Information Act passed in 1966 and allows anyone to request documents from the US government unless these documents are undisclosable. So back in 2018, an article was published to Muckrock's website outlining how someone sent in a FOIA request for some information about Antifa and other white supremacist groups, and they did receive some documents back about those groups. But it seems that whoever at the government was sending these documents back accidentally shared a zip file called EM effects on human body.zip. EM in this case standing for electromagnetic. And within this zip file, there were several images outlining how certain strange effects could be produced when humans were shot with very concentrated beams of electromagnetic radiation. So, according to these documents, they were able to induce intense itching sensations behind someone's eyelids. They could force someone to temporarily lose a significant portion of their memory. They could induce violent muscle spasms and areas of pain all over someone's body, and a lot of other outrageous stuff. Now, the legitimacy of these documents is to be taken with a grain of salt. They're very vague about how exactly these effects are being induced, and it's just unlikely that they would have accidentally made such an erroneous mistake releasing documents like these. It doesn't look like anything has come of this since 2018, but maybe that's just what they want us to think. Bog bodies are stored as super disease. So a bog body is a human corpse that has been preserved and mummified within peat in a bog being a swampy area, and peat being a naturally occurring material made of decomposed plants and moss. Well, some people have theorized that people who died thousands of years ago and were preserved in bogs may contain some ancient disease or have developed some really dangerous diseases over time, and that some governmental agencies might be attempting to prepare to use these bog bodies as weapons in biological warfare. So they would harness whatever disease these bodies are carrying and then release them and kill a bunch of people. Now, biological warfare is outlawed in the United Nations, but I guess if the world got to such a state of disarray, maybe the governments would just, send out these ancient diseases. Kov thief clock theory. So, back on May 31st of 2017 at 12:06 a.m., Donald Trump made a tweet that just read, "Despite the constant negative press, Kov thief," and nobody had any clue what he meant by that. Kov thief seemed to be a completely made-up word, and people were pretty confused. The tweet was deleted a few hours later, and then Trump tweeted, "Who can figure out the true meaning of Kov thief? Enjoy." So this led a few people to theorize that instead of Kov thief just being a random typo, it was some sort of code word that Trump was using to communicate to other informed government officials about some sort of event that was going on behind the scenes of the government, or that Kov thief was a word that was indicative of some sort of timer that would signal something to happen in the government. Although this is an interesting theory, I'd say it's most likely that he was probably just really drunk and trying to spell coverage. The Simpsons theory. So this one is probably the most out there, and I kind of feel like this one is satire. You also might have heard of this one before. The Simpsons theory states that despite the Simpsons TV show being portrayed as an animated television show, it is actually real footage that is being taken of a town that's been destructed by a nuclear power plant accident. And everything in The Simpsons is real footage. And the reason that people don't look like people is because of how many diseases they're suffering from due to the nuclear leak. The theory also points to environmental effects of this leak, like how in Season 1, Episode 7, when they're walking through the forest, you can see some unnaturally colored leaves, and how in Season 1, Episode 2, you can see a houseplant that starts out as green, but is shown in a later scene as orange. Instead of these just being, creative choices or like simple mistakes in animation, it's clearly indicative that, there's a broader historical context happening here. There is a lot more information about this theory, but it gets really out of control, and come on. We kill the universe every time we look at dark matter. This whole thing cost me 93 cents at Kroger. So, back in 2007, a study was published by Lawrence Krauss, who is a pretty significant and well-respected physicist. This study looked at a lot of very experimental and hypothetical ideas, but the main idea was that when we measure properties of dark matter in the universe, we may be decreasing the lifespan of the universe. Now, it's theorized that dark matter exists in a quantum state, which very basically means its position and properties are not concrete and have not been decided yet. However, when dark matter is observed by someone, it is forced to choose a state to exist in, because when it's being observed, it can't exist in multiple places at the same time. So, when we observe dark matter, we are forcing it to collapse to a less stable state, which accelerates the decay of the dark matter and therefore diminishes the expansion of the universe and may result in a total collapse known as the Big Crunch. Now, this is purely hypothetical, and it's also very likely that the universe doesn't act this way in practice, but while not much is known about the properties of dark matter, this is simply a theory. Gangstalking paradigm. So this one is probably the most broad on here. So if you're not familiar with gangstalking, it's essentially the belief that someone is being stalked by a group of people or an organization, and this stalking is being organized to target this one individual. In almost all cases of reported gangstalking, it seems that the person who believes they're a victim is really just suffering from some extreme paranoia, and as far as I can tell, there have been very few actual cases of organized stalking. The Belangi gangstalking paradigm is referring to a theory that states that the deep state governments within the United States and European governments are targeting and harassing people and attempting to brainwash them. Deep state governments are rumored organizations that exist within larger governments and often are depicted to be in a lot more control and under a lot more secrecy than the standard government. I have not been able to find anything that would support this United States and European government gangstalking theory. 1890 U.S. Census intentional destruction. So, every 10 years in the United States, the U.S. government holds a census which collects data on the population of the entire country. This has occurred every 10 years since 1790. Well, back in 1921, almost the entirety of the 1890 census was seemingly destroyed in a fire. However, this theory states that this wasn't actually the case. Back in March of 1896, the portions of the 1890 census concerned with mortality, crime rates, and special classes were destructed by a fire. However, almost all of the population records were completely unharmed. That was until January 10th of 1921, where about 25% of the remaining records were destroyed by a fire, which was exclusive to the basement floor of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. Now, this census was one of the only ones to not have had copies made for archival purposes, so the only copy of this census was the one that was destroyed by the fire. Following this fire in 1933, in order to clear up space, the Census Bureau authorized the destruction of the entire rest of that census. And, things are kind of starting to look suspicious here. The only real reason I can find that people theorize that this destruction was intentional is that up until 1890, this had been the most detailed census yet, and it contained information regarding race and gender and stuff like that. So it's possible that there were some demographics of any sort that some political entity didn't like, so they had the records destroyed. But I don't know, man. Transient global amnesia and gray spacing. So transient global amnesia is a neurological condition that can occur seemingly randomly in people, wherein they temporarily lose all memory and cannot form any new memories. These episodes last on average about 6 hours, and when they're over, the person has no recollection of anything that happened. If you've watched Breaking Bad, when Walter gets kidnapped by Tuco and makes his way back to Albuquerque, in order to cover for his absence, he confesses in confidentiality to a psychologist who gives him a false diagnosis of transient global amnesia. Well, what this conspiracy theory states is that transient global amnesia is actually a product of intentional memory deletion or manipulation by some governmental entity or extraterrestrial creatures. Pretty much all of the evidence for this theory is solely anecdotal, and no current medical understanding of TGA would support this hypothesis. Jesus died in Japan. So, traditionally in the Bible, it's believed that Jesus Christ was born in a town called Bethlehem, and he lived to the age of about 33 before being crucified by Roman authorities in a town called Golgotha, which was just outside the walls of Jerusalem. After being dead for 3 days, Jesus was resurrected and lived for 40 more days before ascending back to heaven. Well, this theory states that when Jesus was about 21, he visited Japan to study theology, and this took place during his lost years, which was a period of about 12 years of Jesus' life, which are pretty much unaccounted for in the New Testament. When he was about 33, he returned to Judea from Japan to discuss the sacred land he had visited. However, when Jesus was captured by Roman authorities and sentenced to crucifixion, he actually swapped places with his brother named Isukiri and fled back to Japan. Once he arrived in Japan in a town called Shingo, he adopted a new identity and lived out his life with a family until he was 106 years old. Now, as far as I can tell, the only real evidence that this took place was that in 1936, a team of archaeologists found a scripture in Shingo that was Jesus' last will and testament, and in this scripture, Jesus described how he got to Japan and how he lived his final years. Now, I can't speak on the authority of this theory over the actual Bible, and I can't speak on the authority of the actual Bible, so that's for you to decide. Whichever you find more appealing to believe, I'd say, is what I would believe. All-field radar trip screens. So, all-field radar trip screens are these rumored devices that can supposedly monitor track, and to some extent manipulate fields of space and time. These devices have the capability of detecting any type of movement within an area and are theorized to be used by governmental entities to monitor populations. Now, as far as I can tell, this is purely speculative. It is possible that governments have access to some form of technology with similar capabilities, and I'd say it's even likely, but I can find little to no discussion of all-field radar trip screens pretty much anywhere. Haunted Mexican calculators. Alright, so this one is referring to a batch of calculators that were produced in Mexico. And these calculators would repeatedly produce incorrect results, or results that were incomprehensible, and it's said that these results demonstrated some sinister agenda. People theorize that these calculators were haunted by the overworked factory workers who died under mysterious circumstances. I really think this one can just be chalked up to like a programming error. C-sections cause autism. So, from what I can tell here, there's actually a decent bit of scientific research into this one. However, the research proves this for a different reason than what the conspiracy theory states. This might get a little bit odd here as well. This theory states that when a child's head is pushed through the birth canal during a natural birth, this helps to form hemispherical networks due to the pressure applied to the head and body. I was not able to find any evidence that this is the case, so I don't think it's true that when a baby's head is pushed through the birth canal, hemispherical connections are formed, and that if you're missing those connections, you have an increased likelihood of having autism. I don't think that's true. However, I have found evidence that when a child is birthed naturally, they ingest a lot of bacteria that help them develop a healthy gut microbiome, which is not really present before birth, and a healthy gut microbiome can definitely influence the possibility that you may have various neurological disorders, including autism. So when a baby is born through a C-section, they aren't really exposed to this bacteria in the birth canal, so their gut microbiome can be much weaker at birth, and this might cause autism. Seemingly, C-sections have shown a 2.9% increase in the likelihood of autism in children, but again, not for the reasons that this conspiracy theory is stating. Pompeii was destroyed for the same reason as Sodom and Gomorrah. So, in Genesis 19:29 of the Bible, two cities are discussed called Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible mentions that these cities were kind of known for their wickedness, they didn't repent for their sins, and they were negatively influencing the cities around them. I don't think this is ever explicitly stated in the Bible, but it's widely believed that these cities housed many homosexuals who attempted to assault angels when they visited the towns, and this is why God wanted to destroy these towns. I'm not saying that homosexuality is a sin, okay? So God sent down two angels to inform a citizen of Sodom, Lot, that he was going to destroy the towns. Once Lot and his family had left Sodom, sulfur and fire began to rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah, which destroyed the cities. Well, some people have theorized that before Pompeii was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the people had been engaging in similar sinful acts to those in Sodom and Gomorrah, which is why the city was destroyed by the volcanic eruption. Historically, art that's been recovered from Pompeii very commonly depicts pretty inappropriate sexual acts, so it's theorized that God triggered the eruption of Mount Vesuvius to destroy the town of Pompeii for the same reason he did Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I guess this just comes down to how much you believe in God. Personally, I believe it's just more likely that the town was right next to an active volcano, and there's really only one way that can end. Loud purple electricity. So, loud purple electricity is supposedly a phenomenon that's been observed near military testing sites. Accounts of this loud purple electricity state that they're bright, violet-colored flashes of light, and afterwards there's a low, deafening hum. These flashes of electricity resemble lightning, but don't come from the sky and appear in smaller, more contained spots lower down in the sky. People have theorized that these are evidence of some new technologies being tested by the military, since several times these have been reported happening near military bases. However, there is also a natural phenomenon called ball lightning, and I think it's more likely that this is what people are witnessing. Ball lightning is when, instead of lightning usually striking as it does with sharp, jagged edges and only being visible for a split second, a small sphere of electricity will hover in the sky or even just above the ground and can last for up to about a minute before combusting and leaving behind an odor of sulfur. This is an incredibly rare phenomenon, and not much is known about the science behind it. I'd say it's pretty likely that the military is, testing some some new technologies, but also the ball lightning could be a logical explanation for that as well. Homunculus recipes. So, scientifically speaking, the term homunculus refers to a now extinct genus of monkey from Argentina. However, a homunculus can also refer to a small artificial humanoid that is created through alchemy. Alchemy just being the ancient, more primitive form of modern-day chemistry. This idea of creating a homunculus was first referenced in the late 15th century, where Paracelsus outlines how if you incubate male sperm in the right way for about 40 days and feed it human blood, it will develop into a small little person. Now, obviously, this doesn't really work. I even tried it. However, there have been other theorized recipes, all being variations of the way you incubate and treat samples of male sperm. Unfortunately, it looks like you can't really create a small little person in this way. These days, the term homunculus is often used to describe a distorted model of a human that is represented of how much space each body part takes up in the motor cortex of your brain. So this funny looking guy is essentially meant to demonstrate that in your brain's motor cortex, the majority of space is allocated to the function of your hands and fingers, since that's the largest part of the model. 1962 Pensacola incident. So back in March of 1962, 5 teenagers got together in Florida and got on a 7-foot raft where they were going to sail out about 2 miles from the shore of the Gulf of Mexico and check out the semi-submerged USS Massachusetts shipwreck. Well, 5 guys went out there and only 1 came back. The one survivor, Brian McCleary, said that while they were sailing out there, the sunny sky turned gray and stormy, and a thick fog developed, which really limited their visibility, and that out of this fog, a large sea monster came out and picked off the 4 teens one by one as Brian swam back the shore, where he was found asleep the next day. Brian McCleary was interviewed by police, where he drew a picture of the sea monster, which looked like this. For the next several months, Brian was incredibly depressed, not only because he lost a lot of his friends, but also because nobody believed his story about the sea monster. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2017. I'd say it is possible that there was some sort of sea monster, but it's more unlikely since there hasn't been any other documentation of this sea monster being seen. I'd say it's more likely that Brian and his friends probably dropped acid or some other hallucinogenic drug while they were out on the raft, and the 4 teens did actually just drown because of an intense storm, but Brian was on acid, so he thought it was a sea monster. I don't want to discount Brian's story. I just think that may be a more likely scenario. Lifelong Facebook connection. So, back in 1997, a student of Carnegie Mellon University approached Chester Gordon Bell, who was a pretty influential electrical engineer back in the day. The student asked Bell if he could scan all of his books and documents into a database about computer science history. Bell agreed, and instead of just moving on, he decided to start collecting incredible amounts of data about every single facet of his life. He began working with Microsoft, and he would archive every email, every note, and everything he searched on the internet. He wore a camera on his neck that would repeatedly capture photos, and a GPS tracker that would log everywhere he went. He did this for a few years, and eventually he'd built up a pretty good collection of all this data stored on his computer. He extrapolated the data and estimated that without video footage, an 80-year-old would be able to store all of their data from their entire life in just about a terabyte. In 2002, Bell wrote a paper about his experience with this excessive data storage, and him and his team eventually caught the attention of the United States military. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA of the military, reached out to him, and they discussed how it would be possible to track movements and data of soldiers in the same way, which they called life logging. Essentially, troops would go out on patrol while wearing all these cameras and collecting all this information, and the military theorized that given enough data, they'd be able to use artificial intelligence models to predict the nature of human decision-making. However, after 9/11, the government was really cracking down on clandestine surveillance programs, and they uncovered an organization called Total Information Awareness. The goal of this program was to sift through information like passports, visas, work permits, driver's licenses, credit card transactions, airline tickets, car rentals, gun purchases, and a lot of other things. And the purpose of this was was to identify potential terrorists. Now, that makes it sound like they're doing it for a good cause, but really, they were kind of just putting together a database of the actions of millions of innocent American citizens. In 2003, Congress shut down total information awareness, and shortly after, also shut down DARPA's life logging program. This happened on February 4th of 2004, and this is where the conspiracy theory kind of starts. However, something else also happened on February 4th of 2004. Mark Zuckerberg launched a website that he called the Facebook. Now, I'm not going to sit here and explain Facebook to you. Aside from the simple coincidence that the two events happened to fall on the same date, there are some other suspicious characteristics involved. Facebook's first big outside investor, whose name was Peter Thiel, actually worked with the National Security Agency on a company called Palantir, which was to conduct mass surveillance. Additionally, the U.S. intelligence community had invested in several Silicon Valley firms that mine data from Facebook and other social media websites. I'd say that Facebook and LifeLog probably weren't directly connected. It just so happened that the same day LifeLog shut down, Facebook started up. Soviet submarine K-129 lost nukes. So, back in 1968, there was a Soviet war submarine that was carrying several ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads. On one of its deployments in the Pacific Ocean, it went silent, and after 2 weeks of silence, the Soviet Navy deployed military aircraft to search for the submarine, but it wasn't found. While this was happening, the United States military was keeping close watch on any Soviet activity, so they also realized that this submarine had gone missing and subsequently went searching for it themselves. Using underwater acoustic technology, they actually did find the wreckage of the submarine, which was like hundreds of miles away from where the Soviets were looking. In a clandestine Cold War program called Project Azorian, they recovered a portion of the submarine from 4.9 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. Once the Soviets caught wind of this, the United States claimed they stumbled upon it accidentally while mining for manganese, but nobody really believed that because at the time, this was the deepest recovery for a submarine ever. Now, in like 2010, someone requested the documentation from the CIA regarding the recovery of the Soviet K-129 with a FOIA request, which we talked about earlier. The CIA argued, however, that the documents needed to remain classified because, quote, official acknowledgement of involvement by U.S. government agencies would disclose the nature and purpose of the program, and many deemed this as legal jargon known as the Glomar response, which essentially means that they didn't really confirm or deny anything about it and just kind of said a bunch of words. The CIA also stated that the documents were insignificant because they really only recovered a very small number of irrelevant pieces of machinery, so it didn't really matter. But it's theorized that the government likely recovered some of the missiles and nuclear warheads that were present on this submarine and just didn't want anyone to find out. Total predictive anticipatory software. So, in order to understand what total predictive anticipatory software is, we need to understand what predictive anticipatory activity is. Predictive anticipatory activity, or PAA, is essentially referring to small, often unnoticeable changes in our body's activity that occur when we are subconsciously aware of something that's about to happen, but aren't actively anticipating it to happen. PAA is usually tied to more pseudoscientific claims, stating that we can detect randomly delivered stimuli occurring 10 seconds in the future, even if we would have no idea that something was going to happen, which isn't widely considered to be true, but we're going to suspend our disbelief a little bit because this is a conspiracy theory video. So, total predictive anticipatory software is referring to the theory that some popular software or popular websites are able to observe small movements or mannerisms that people make when navigating the internet and are able to compare those to broader historical processes and essentially predict what you're going to do before you do it. So they can tailor the advertisements or services to you when you haven't directly conveyed that that's what you're looking for. So, like, if you've ever been thinking of needing something, we'll say, like, you've been thinking to yourself that you need to go to the store and get some yogurt. You might see an advertisement for yogurt online later that day, even though you haven't even said out loud that you needed yogurt, or like searched online for yogurt. This conspiracy theory would state that you likely exhibited similar movements or navigational patterns to other people who then bought yogurt later that day. So the algorithms used by these big companies already know that you want yogurt before you even display that you want yogurt. Now, I know I've said a lot of insane stuff in this video, but I kind of feel like there might be a hint of truth to this one. Probably not in the exact way that I've described here, but there have been a shocking number of times that I've gotten advertisements for something that I only thought to myself that I needed, and I'm sure that's happened to you as well. Then again, probably just a coincidence. You know, I think that can be said about a lot of things we talked about today. And that's going to be the end of today's video. I'd like to apologize. I know I've been gone for several months. I really am grateful because I know that there's a significant factor of luck that's involved when, you know, you get a little bit of notoriety on like YouTube or whatever. And I don't want to seem like I'm squandering this opportunity that's been given to me. I really do appreciate all of the support that has been demonstrated on this channel. And I just want to say I'm getting on a better upload schedule. I'm going to try to be releasing like at least 20-minute videos at least once a month. AP exam season if anybody else is in high school.